wanted to be here tonight and couldn't make it, so wanted to record the session so we could share it with them. So Tim, thanks for that introduction. And as you know, many of you have connected with me, I run an organization called Cometa that I started here in Greensboro that has an explicit focus on building community. And as we were doing our events and we were bringing people together for something we called Stories of Us, which was a local storytelling night that allowed people in the community to connect, we ran into COVID, and we pivoted, like many organizations, to try to do things online. And we had a Stories of Us online on Earth Day. And at that event, we had a number of people who joined us, and the sense was that COVID has really disrupted life, but we didn't want to go back to the world that existed before. So much was broken. And the question was, could we emerge from this challenge, this very deep challenge that the world is facing right now, in a better way? And what would that take? So that was really the beginnings for thinking about ReGenesis Greensboro, which is an effort to gather the voices of people in the community to ask them, what's the future you would like? And really then to use that expression as a way to come together as we're doing today and make sense of what it is that we're saying, and then hopefully move to start to activate the future you want through efforts that are grounded in community. So we'll talk much more about where do we go from here, but we'd like to start out with being able to share with you some of the data that we've gathered. So over to you, Tim. Tim, you're muted, by the way.
Rookie mistake. You'd think I'd learned better by now. So we're getting into our methodology here. We ran this survey primarily on Google Forms, kept it open for 8 weeks, posing the question to people, what is your desired future for Greensboro? And then we gave an optional response afterwards with any other comments and optional demographics. And since the survey was anonymous, perhaps that's why we got almost everyone to share their demographic information. You can see here that our respondents very much reflect the audience that's been coming to the Cometa Stories of Us events, which is natural since we launched this survey through Stories of Us. It's a more white and female population than the general demographics of Greensboro. However, we're fairly confident that these responses reflect people who are very plugged in across the city to civic initiatives and reflect common sentiments across the city. One other thing to note is that for a brief period, we worked with an interpreter who collected responses from residents who don't speak English and submitted those responses on their behalf. Next slide, if you would, Lyndon. So this is just to show you all that we had a pretty diverse array of people in people's professional situations, whether students working for or not-for-profits, as well as people who are very rooted in the community in Greensboro, many of whom have lived here for more than 10 years. Next slide, if you will. So our approach was what might be referred to academically as a phenomenological inquiry. And what we mean by that is that we're looking for patterns in text data that represents a particular period in time for people's lives for our community in Greensboro. And we had volunteers from Code for Greensboro and Cometa come together to independently review responses and analyze the data together. So as we started reviewing, we each noticed and then validated this thinking that we were seeing 3 distinct patterns. Many respondents talked about aspirational visions for the future. So that was our most common. 41% of responses focused on building a better future together. 25% then kind of focused on this foundational aspect of what's required to live a good life and move into the future together as a community. Well, then another subset, we're focusing on what we could only call the fix-it category, bringing up things that needed to change or things that they couldn't live with and see us move into that future that they were hoping to achieve together. And after we validated these patterns, we wanted to interpret the content in these responses. So these 13 categories represent what people were bringing up and highlighting in either their aspirational foundational, or fix-it vision for what's required in the future. And some of the responses had more than one category. And so that's why these numbers together add up to more than 325. But across those, the most common were people talking about structural racism and inequality, especially, which we bucketed into that category you see here called DEI. And then following from that, people who wanted to see us come together. Oh, sorry, Lyndon, if you'll go back for a sec. People wanting to see us come together more as a community, and that coming together was what's required for the future. Economic development, safety, and justice followed close behind. And so as we, next slide, please. And so as we sort of grappled with what people are saying and what they're expressing, we realized that people were talking about an aspirational future in a specific way. They're foundational and the things that they wanted to see fixed in specific ways. And you see here, the plus represents that aspirational vision. The equal sign, more of these foundational things that are required for us to move forward. And then that minus sign is the things that harm us, the things that bring down our community. And so this reflects our interpretation of what people were expressing as their hopes and frustrations with Greensboro and what they wanted to see as a part of a thriving future forward community. Now, as I turn it back over to Lyndon to take a deeper dive into these, please go ahead and share any questions or comments that you have in the chat, and we'll try to address a few in a moment. There will be space in a little bit in breakout sessions that we'll organize everyone into to discuss more and get a lot deeper with each other into what these mean for you and your life here in the community. And even later, we'll provide a link back to the COMETA website where you can access summaries of each category and engage with the raw data for yourself. So over to you, Lyndon.
Thank you, Tim. So Tim talked about these three layers, the things that harm us, that kind of diminish our community, the things that are foundational, that sustain the community, that we want to make sure are strong and healthy. And then there are the things that are, to some degree, nice to have, but when we have these are the things that kind of totally enrich the life of the community and make it better. So there's a quote that we got from one of the respondents that really encapsulates all of this. And the person said, I want to see Greensboro become a place that's not afraid of all our truths, not just the ones that make us look good. We have to be willing to look into our history, acknowledge and listen to the many voices whose realities have not aligned, and truly make room for the diverse stories, skills, cultures, approaches, dialects, and dreams. So I think that's really what's come through from the data, the things that are good, the things that are essential, and the things that are really harming us. So let's take a closer look at what people have to say. And so what we've done here is just sample a single quote from each category, but we'll share a link back with you at the end of this presentation where you can come in online and look at all the data, all the responses we received. So just starting with the positives here of the things that actually elevate community, what people were saying about this space was that, you know, the arts are really important. This idea of actually having a peaceful, harmonious, artsy town with a lot of entertainment and community events. These things make our community better, and we want more of that. Greensboro is a city that's blessed with a lot of green spaces, and people truly value this, right? And the impetus is to say, how can we make this even better? How can we plant more trees and also create more opportunities for bike lanes, e-vehicles, charging stations? And complementing this is also for our mindset about what do we do to limit the level of waste and create opportunities for us to have access to local food. And this will also emerge later when we talk about hunger, that this idea of actually having access to food and local markets is important to many people. And thirdly, then, this notion of thriving. Thriving is, in a way, a meta goal, but in here, it was really about this notion of a good place to live, one that provides a high quality of life that we enjoy. And when you have a thriving city, it's one that often attracts a lot of people who want to come live here, especially young people. So here, again, from the quote that we have, you know, funky, vibrant, multicultural, inclusive, just and prosperous, but not too big city with a clear sense of its identity. Something different from Asheville, but more just and more inclusive. So the small town feel is something that people truly cherish about Greensboro, but one that has a lively art scene with a great ecology here. So let's turn to the things that sustain us. These things are foundational, and they're not nice to have, they're essential. And we want to make sure that these are fairly strong. So healthcare is one of these. And people said, it's not that we don't have good healthcare in town, it's that we want to make sure that people have access to it. And in this age of COVID, there's a fear from some people that you can't afford healthcare anymore. It wasn't something that emerged, as Tim shared with us with those bar graphs, something that was very high on the list, but it is certainly present. And you'll see here also this expression of poverty and inequality that seems to run through everything that we have here. When we come to education, there's a recognition of, again, education is key to the fabric of the city. It's what makes people want to come here, people want to stay here. And we're blessed with a pretty good educational infrastructure. But when you look at the comments that really came in after this, a lot of them were about how unequal the school system is. But we've got institutions that are pretty strong. And there are other parts of town where the schools don't have many resources, the kind of teaching capability that we might wish. So it's really a very uneven picture. And especially when we come to colleges and universities, you'll see in the data, once you get a chance to look at that, people talked about the colleges and universities that we have here in abundance, but that they're not really plugged into the city and we don't leverage them or serve them very well. Coming back to community, which was really high on this poll, not surprisingly perhaps for Cometa, but it's at the heart of what this is all about. And there's a great quote here from one of the respondents who spoke to the issue here. And she said, or he said, no one can transform a community alone. It takes a village. We need more people to get involved in our community. And the person says, after a decade of constant traveling, I realized it's not about the place where you live. It's about the people who live in the place. So it's really people who make a community, despite all the assets that might be there. And it's in a way, we'll see a certain kind of call to action. We come over to the economy. This is again something where we see this issue of inequality show up. But the quote here that we picked says that for this current season, there's a need to unleash a wave of creativity and innovation in providing economic mobility for disadvantaged populations. This seems to be a central thrust. We're at a time where innovation is so important to us that we need to transform our community. But the thrust of it, where that innovation is needed, is fundamentally about addressing this issue of inequality that exists here. When we talk about governance too, a lot of the sentiments were that we need a government that is much more in tune with the people, that reflects the values and the priorities of the community. And there is a sense today that that's not often the case, that governance has been effective in the past and accomplished some things, but right now the needs of the community are not very much in sync in what people are seeing from local government. When we come down to what diminishes us, and there were a lot of comments about this. So as we think about this question that we asked about, what do you want from the future? It's interesting that a lot of the comments were a lot about what's wrong in the community right now. So this is very pressing. Again, we live in a time of COVID where, of course, a lot of the national poets indicate that people are fairly down and discouraged by the state of things. So that's reflective here. But it also talks very clearly about what's going on in our community. So poverty is something that shows up, right? And it's really what connects a lot of what's here. And the sentiment here in this quote is that we want Greensboro's budgets, the priorities of the city, to really reflect our beliefs. And there is a gap there. When you talk about safety and justice, again, a lot of comments about that. I'll read the comment that we placed here. I want to live in a city where every citizen, regardless of their race, creed, or color, can walk down the street without being harassed or assaulted by the police or other citizens. This is very prevalent, the feeling that a lot of people in the city have to fear from the police and the level of perhaps police brutality that exists here. And we want this to be addressed. Racism and inequality, this is the one factor that showed up at the top of the 13. And like I say, it colors everything in the poll. And this is a person who says, we are a city divided by race, color, and class. Those in power seem to have blinders on regarding this fact. And another quote is that I would like Greensboro to be a leader in equity and civil rights. This is a city that really pioneered the civil rights movement. And there are many expressions of aspiration that say, what if we could turn this around? What if we could be a model to the country with all the diversity that we have here and turn that into a strength? But we've got a long way to go because this inequality just permeates so much of the experience of people in the city. Housing and homelessness are things that are, again, connected to poverty. The need for safe and affordable housing are two critical areas that need attention. And when we think about hunger and food insecurity, it's not something that everybody feels, but there's a recognition that it's very real and very systemic and significant for the people who are affected. You know, this person says, I would love for my entire community to have access to safe and affordable housing, quality healthcare, enough food to feed their entire household. So again, a person saying, this may not be my situation, but I recognize there's so many people in the community that are going hungry, and it's a problem. So if you put it all together, this is my take on what the story is. What's this emerging narrative from all this data? So Greensboro is a place that people love. They believe it has much going for it, and one that has a lot of promise. It's a small town feel, it's the art scene, it's the environment. There's a lot that we appreciate, the level of diversity that's here, right? But there are very, very deep concerns about the state of inequality that permeates almost everything in this poll. 50% of the responses mentioned this quality of inequality. And it's all the more, I think, striking given that 75% of the respondents actually white. And if white people, if you will, recognize the state of inequality, you know that factor is even greater than what's represented here. And again, if we come back to how do we create change? How do these things shift? There's a sense that the governance we have isn't adequate or as responsive to our challenges. And one could say that the challenges we face are very difficult to solve regardless of who's in government, regardless of the state of who's leading things. So this notion of community being key, that it's actually up to all of us to step up and figure out how we can lead together and create the community that we want. So this is what people are pointing to in the data. And I'm really delighted that we have with us actually three guests that we'd like to draw on as discussants. And this is Justin Capanuso, Ziti Namalo, and Joe Rotundi, who are three people from our community who played and have played very, very significant roles. And I'd like to invite them to maybe share with us their thoughts and perhaps engage in a short conversation about the meaning of this, because we find ourselves in a time that is, if you will, a certain kind of tipping point. The challenges are very, very significant, but Greensboro has been able to address significant challenges in the past and come through it. And Justin will be able to speak to that. Ziti, who's really involved in the community in terms of some of the issues around race and equality, can speak to this moment and the significance of it and how the community is coming together to address it and what's needed. And Joe Rotundi, who some of you know from former stories of his, and of course his work in the community, heads up the Forge. And Joe is a model for building a thriving community in that microcosm and speaks to how we can build entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship in the city. So I'd like to begin with Justin, if you will. And Justin, you might need to take yourself off mute, but if you could offer some perspective, especially about the past, because as you've played the role of kind of editor of the Triad Business Journal, you've had a frontline view on the story of Greensboro and how we've been able to come around and what's the significance of what we might need at this time. Over to you, Justin.
Linda, thank you, and Tim as well for putting this together. You know, my view is more historical, and when Linda and I talked about this the other day, he thought that this could be of value. So and from my perspective as leading the Business Journal, when it first started back around 1998, there was a re-envisioning of Greensboro then. There was another process then, and it started around 2000, 2001, when the foundations in this community, they commissioned a study by the McKinsey Group. We were kind of a community in free fall. Our corporations were largely checked out because of their own economic pressures, and these were the large textile companies. They were laying off people by the tens of thousands. They were really struggling to stay afloat. And so there was this void of leadership in this community. The political leadership wasn't very strong either. McKinsey came back with a report, and the word that stuck out more than anything else is that Greensboro was a mediocre place. And it was sort of shocking to the folks that read the report because there's a lot of pride in Greensboro. And 6 foundations came together to try to figure out what it was that they could do. This is a story that Walker Sanders, who's on this meeting, knows very well. And what the foundations did was they did their due diligence, but in essence, they decided that they would become the surrogate leadership for this community for a long period of time, for about 5 years or more. And they put up over $50 million for a variety of projects. And it started with a trip of all community leaders. We all were loaded onto a private plane, a chartered flight to Chattanooga, and saw what the city of Chattanooga had done with foundation leadership and how they'd revitalized the city without half the resources of Greensboro. Really, they've got a river, but after that, like, Greensboro had it all over Chattanooga. But here was a thriving city with a downtown that was coming back, with residents that lived downtown, a ballpark, a nautical museum. They really had a cool place that we got to see and experience. And these foundation leaders came back, and they had some community meetings, and people came out really by the scores. I mean, maybe by the hundreds in some of the early meetings. It was pretty impressive the way the community came out. And they were divided into various groups that were looking at economic development and entrepreneurship. They were looking at education. They were looking at leadership issues. I don't think race was as big a factor then as it is now. It really was about sort of jump-starting the community. And the message from Chattanooga was, do something, break ground. Like, you're gonna get a lot of people that are negative. You're gonna get a lot of people taking crack shots at you. So get started and do something. And that's what this group of Action Greensboro folks did over the period of 5 years. And we have been enjoying the fruits of that since then. So we've got a ballpark that came directly from Action Greensboro. We have renovations and activity downtown that was a result of Action Greensboro, including support for one of the first high-end condo projects downtown. Getting people living downtown was important to revitalizing downtown. A lot of money went to the Center for Creative Leadership to train educational leaders, principals and vice principals. Education was seen as key to this whole effort. The thing that's critical, and entrepreneurial support as well. So there was money for entrepreneurs to invest in new companies. There really was this sense that, that these folks had resources. And with those resources and with the community leadership, really the community input that they were hearing, they prioritized the things that they wanted to do. There were things that they wanted to do anyway. And so to a certain degree, they heard what they wanted to hear, and they went ahead, like, we were going to have a ballpark no matter what. And we got a great ballpark out of that. And it was paid for almost entirely with private dollars. So we hit this moment now, like 20 years later, where Action Greensboro has played its role, it's had its impact. It's now an organization that is smaller and it has a more focused role here in the community. We've got other groups as well. The foundations have gone back to doing what they normally do and supporting the things that they are focused on rather than these citywide issues. But now we find ourselves at this sort of pivot point where we are trying to reimagine how to make this community better. And I want to end with this, with just a little insight with an interview I had several months ago for the environmental news organization I write for now. I interviewed an environmentalist by the name of Kinnery Webb. This is a woman who went to Borneo and really rescued communities in Borneo from deforestation because she was concerned about a species there, the orangutan, and its habitat. It's really rare and endangered species. One of the things she found was that the reason why deforestation was taking place is because the people were poor, they were cutting down trees. It was the only way they had of making money. And they needed healthcare. What they were selling the trees for was healthcare. She was a doctor. She brought them healthcare. And she said, now we got to get you guys to stop cutting down trees. And rather than tell them what they should do, she had this thing called radical listening. She went to about 30 different villages throughout this region in Borneo and sat down with the people that lived in that community for hours and listened to their ideas about how they could alter, change, and sort of move their economic fortunes. And they had ideas. They knew what they wanted. They didn't want to be cutting down those trees. They didn't want to ruin their own environment. It was the only choice they had. It was this bottom-up effort. Action Greensboro had a bit of that. It had a bit of that bottom-up effort, listening to what the community wanted to do, although they really did have their own priorities in mind and what they absolutely were going to do. So as we think about moving forward, I think we do run the risk of sort of a top-down, like, this is what we need to do, particularly as we move into our minority communities that are struggling right now. My sense is they know the answers to what they need, and they need support. They need to be listened to. And they need to be able to push their ideas forward and have the money to do it. I don't know where the money is to do that now. I don't know whether this is something the foundations will want to take another crack at. The thing is, it happened before, a generation ago, 20 years ago. And Greensboro is richer because of it in very, very tangible ways. And now we need to do it again with a different dynamic.
Thank you, Justin. Well, with that, I'm going to stop sharing so we can see each other. And I'd love to invite Ziddy to speak. And Ziddy, as I mentioned, is at the heart of what's going on right now in being able to rally people to address these issues of racism in the community. And Ziddy, what are you taking away from the data? And could you share how the community might move forward to address these needs?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Lyndon and Tim, for having me on here. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Justin, for having me as a part of the conversation. I want to start out just by sharing a little bit about my story. I do that just to offer context. I appreciate Justin sharing a bit about Greensboro's history. And I love that. I love starting out with history because it really does give like a framework and context to the conversation. I am originally from Swaziland, which is a small country on the border of South Africa. And when I was 4 years old, my parents, who both were working in the medical field in Swaziland, decided that they wanted to come to America. And so we were your stereotypical African immigrant story. They both got student visas to Greensboro College. And as a 4-year-old little girl, I was riding in the red wagon of our neighbor, Suzanne Rosenblum, to preschool at First Baptist Church. And so I'm a product of Peeler Open School, Irwin, Aycock Middle School before the name changed. I went to Dudley High School. I went to Guilford College undergrad. I got my master's at UNCG, and then I got my PhD from A&T. And I say that because throughout my entire Greensboro life, I'm very much a Greensboro girl, just as much as I am a Swazi girl. I also have had the honor and the opportunity to build really genuine friendships with a lot of different people. It's quite amazing to be on this call right now because I'm looking at all these different faces and I'm like, oh, you know, I've been in a lot of these people's living rooms. I know these people's kids. Like I went to school with some of these folks. I had an eye doctor appointment today at Guilford Eye Center on New Garden Road, and the young lady who checked me in went to Peeler with me, you know? And so again, I know that I represent a lot of different voices, and there's a lot of pressure that comes with that. I'm like the Black girl on the lineup, and we're talking about systemic racism and injustice. And so I am going to kind of be the chick that says the uncomfortable things about our Greensboro, because I'm Greensboro as well. There's a whole other story. The way that Justin has described it makes Greensboro sound quite exciting, quite amazing, really full of hope and full of opportunity. And for a lot of people, it is. For many people who live in Greensboro, it's not, and it hasn't been for a really, really long time. There are a lot of people who aren't on this call, because if you'll notice, among the faces that we are looking at, very few of them are Black, because the Black folk who are frustrated with Greensboro's problems do not have time to sit on any more of these conversations. I'm willing to do it because I believe that, you know, there's a benefit to it, but I'm only willing to do it under the conditions that we who show up for these conversations are actually willing to take action in response to these problems. East Greensboro, as recently as like 2015, 2016, we have a food desert. For those of us who don't know what that is, we're celebrating all of these restaurants and growth of entrepreneurship and industry, but the Greensboro High Point area for years has been, if not number one, then at least among the top three with food insecurity issues in the nation. And so we've got people who are living in districts 1 and 2 right here in our city who know nothing of this exciting Greensboro. I'm an educator. I teach in the School of Health and Human Sciences at UNCG, and this semester I'll also be teaching ethics and communication at North Carolina A&T. These students are not wanting to stay in Greensboro upon graduation because they feel what many of us aren't willing to admit aloud, and that is that we care more as a city about what things look like to the outside than what it really is in real life. So we are fooling ourselves if we believe that we can look at the data and the charts, and that's beautiful. The data and the charts are beautiful. I'm both a quantitative and a qualitative researcher. I also know that there are folks in East Greensboro who aren't going to complete a survey, you know? And so I've been listening to the different stories of people, and it's an issue of education. there's, you know, there's a cognitive dissonance around what has happened historically to get us to where we are. I'll give you a really concrete example. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, okay? We are a city in the American South. This was a group of white women who, when they felt threatened about the story of the South not being as sexy as they wanted it to be, they literally went into textbooks used in our classrooms by both Black and white children, and they changed the information. They literally changed history in the books that we had in Peeler, in Bluford, in these schools that me and my peers are a product of, that didn't tell the truth, the whole truth, pardon me. They didn't tell the whole truth about what was going on out here. And so for me, one of my areas of focus is education, understanding what really has happened in history. What is implicit bias? You know, in Greensboro, what that looks like is, for those of us who haven't had consistent exposure to the wide and infinite range of what the Black experience is, we look at a Black person and we've already written a story about them before we know a single thing about them. We don't care enough to really know their name. We don't care enough to know really their story. And this is something that happens in the blink of an eye. And when it happens decade after decade, it becomes baked into the DNA of a city's culture. And so we can talk about action plans and data and charts and all of that stuff, but until and unless we're really willing to acknowledge what's happened to us cognitively and psychologically and emotionally to get us into this place, then we're really, really lying to ourselves. So I'm an advocate for truth. I'm a lover of people. I collect stories, and I like to analyze stories on the basis of like the wholeness of them. And so that's really the space that I want to contribute. I'm really happy to see Michelle Gathers-Clark here. She's doing incredible work with United Way. I love what COMED is doing with these community meetings. There's so many other people in Greensboro who have a sincere heart about addressing the truth of this. But we've got to deal with the Black and white thing. We have to be able to talk about it in really plain terms. We have to be willing to get uncomfortable with it. And we have to be brave enough to put our money where our mouth is and acknowledge that, you know, economics, it's not, none of this stuff, none of these 13 categories that Lyndon has so deftly, you know, identified will ever change until we're willing to tell the truth. So I think I'm done.
Thank you, Ziddy. Thanks to you for speaking your truth and sharing with us, you know, what goes on. And I think this, the poll has really brought to light so much of what lies under the surface in Greensboro, and you've expressed that. Well, I'd love to turn it over to Joe. And Joe is somebody who I think is terrific, who's come to Greensboro and started to create a space of transformation. And I think when I look at what he's doing, community is at the heart of it. So Joe, what do you see in the data and what do you see starting to move? And Joe, I also want to call out the fact that in the midst of COVID, your organization, The Forge, was also fairly central in kind of responding and preparing medical equipment in the early days, and people didn't have some. So it was the power of community that rallied together there. So over to you, Joe.
Yeah, thank you, Lyndon. You know, I'm very happy to be invited to this panel, and you know, I'm keenly aware of my whiteness following Ziddy. Thank you for sharing that. It's you know, it's very important to hear those things. You know, I'd like to start a little bit about my story with Greensboro. You know, I mentioned being aware of my whiteness. That's something that I first really felt in Greensboro and was one of my attractors. It's a really diverse community here. I grew up in Florida, and you know, judge me separately for that. Florida has its own challenges, but you know, I came to North Carolina to visit family and didn't really expect to stay, but I came into Greensboro looking around for a job, and I was a bartender at the time, and I really was attracted by the rich diversity here. And as I came to know the population here, you know, at the other side of the bar, serving people in Greensboro, I did feel a sense of pride here, and then I started seeing this, you know, this beautiful potential here in this space. I don't know that there's many small or mid-sized towns that have the level of diversity that Greensboro has. You know, I'm looking at the data. You know, we had about 75% of the respondents are white in a city where white folk make up less than 50% of the population here. And that's, you know, I know that there's issues for us to overcome, but that to me is beautiful. You know, there was divisions obviously, but there's so much potential in removing those divisions. So serving behind the bar, I started becoming more and more interested in serving communities. Was not something I was interested in before. And that road, you know, through you know, different iterations of that road, I stuck to it. And you know, the other thing that kept me in Greensboro, I was attracted by this diversity. I kept in Greensboro because I felt like I could make a difference. And I was able to move into some positions of leadership. You know, led me to the Forge, where, you know, I was able to engage with this community in a really beautiful way and sort of create a microcosm of it. So very early on, you know, it was an intention of the Forge and the board of the Forge to make it into a diverse space that matched the diversity in our community. And you know, we're not there yet. We're working on it. It definitely doesn't match the diversity of the community, but we believe at our core. And I think this is something that could, you know, I hope that would spread to the city, but at its core, creativity at the Forge, you know, a maker space, we're a collection of makers, you know, which is a very core human expression that any human, any culture can have or pursue. That to be creative, you have to feel like you have ownership of something, and you can't be in fear of, you know, of not being accepted, or fear that your voice is going to be pushed down or your idea is going to be moved to the side, because then people don't speak up or share their ideas. So when we mentioned that, you know, people in these minority communities, which, you know, really, if we look at the population of Greensboro and the demographics, not so much minority, right? We look at these populations, you know, we look at Black Americans in Greensboro. It's not so much that we need to sort of like liberate them and listen to them. It's that we need them to share their ideas and their innovation with us, or we're not going to be a strong community. We're losing out every single day that there is half of our population in our city that is not able to, through various barriers, share their creative thoughts, their leadership, their innovations, their perspectives to make this space, make this city a vibrant city. And, you know, those are sort of big words that move beyond the realm of the Forge. But, you know, I see it in small group settings when we're going through problems to fix things inside the Forge, or if we're coming up with a new idea for a new product or to solve a problem that somebody's having with a project. Everyone needs to be able to say their idea, because you don't know who's going to have the right answer. We believe in diversity in every sense of the word at the Forge. That's why we have so many different kinds of making. You know, we have a ceramics area, we have a wood shop, we have a metal shop, we have a sewing area, we have laser engravers, we have, I don't know if I mentioned ceramics, 3D printers, and we accept people of all ages, and we promote people of all diverse backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds, so that we can get all these different perspectives inside the same space. You don't know how that things are going to cross-pollinate. And so what we have tried to do in our space is create that welcoming environment, so that when people come in, they feel like they have ownership of the space. They can add to the feeling of being at the Forge, add to the creativity in that space, and then make it better for the next people who are going to use it. And I think that's, you know, what I would like to contribute to any, you know, form of leadership that's coming up, is that, you know, one, we need to make people feel like their voices matter and that their thoughts are unique and of interest. Because if we don't do that, we're going to lose the best ideas. And this is, you know, Black Americans in 2010 census is almost 50% of our population in Greensboro. That's cutting your good ideas in half. Is just so ridiculous, right? From an objective viewpoint. and of course there's things to get, there's a bunch of division to get by, but there's, what's keeping me here in Greensboro is the potential of removing that division. It may be just East Greensboro versus, I guess West Greensboro. How do we make this like all the population of Greensboro feel like they own it? And once we do that, I think all the other things are going to come to play. We're going to have economic development. We're going to have people starting businesses. We're going to have leadership coming up from all corners of Greensboro. And I don't know how that's solved for the whole space, but I know for the Forge, it's just about anytime somebody comes into the space, it's like, hey, what are you working on? What are you doing? That's so cool, right? It's just, I think Justin mentioned it, radical listening, right? And that's something we can do on an individual basis.
Thank you, Joe.
And I could go on and on about this. I would love to get to a discussion because I tend to work better in discussion. But these minority and these maybe underconnected communities, it's not so much we need to help them, it's we need them in order to become a better city. And so that's where I'd like to end and move into the next phase of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. And I think we had from the three perspectives, Justin talking about a certain kind of story of the past when Greensboro faced a deep crisis and how it was able to rally together in a different way with Action Greensboro to come back from the crisis. There was a certain kind of development that happened that was not about equality, and there were some people that benefited from it, but it left many, many people behind. And we find ourselves in the situation today that Ziddy talked about, which is one that poses significant challenges, especially for our Black citizens. And we're called to do something different. And in many ways, as people talk about the economics of the city and the need for entrepreneurship and new growth, Joe represents that kind of leadership. So one of the things that Justin mentioned when I was speaking with him, it was this idea that we need new leadership today, and it's young people who are willing to step up and lead us into the future. I wonder if I might kind of invite both Justin, Ziddy, and Joe to just take a few minutes, and then we're going to pivot into actually small group conversations where everybody on the call will have a chance to just share their perspectives, their thoughts, and the things that we need to move forward. But maybe if you could just take a couple of minutes and just reflect on the conversation, Justin, Joe, and Ziddy. And you might need to all unmute there.
In any particular order, Lyndon?
Yeah, just Ziddy, why don't you get us started? But what are you hearing in terms of what's the need for now, right? Where do we go from here based on what's emerging in the city, what's going on right now?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most significant things is that we have to be willing to shift what our definition of leadership is. I think that we've fallen victim to the myth that leadership is intimidation or leadership is this weird powering over. And so, like Joe said, the reason our organizations and corporations aren't hearing the best ideas is because these cultures of intimidation don't celebrate like the dissenting opinion. They don't celebrate the truth tellers. As a matter of fact, the truth tellers, if the truth is in opposition to whatever the leader is saying, they get ostracized or boxed out or talked about at the water cooler or whatever. And so who wouldn't want to share their ideas in an environment like that? So I think that we need to redefine leadership, first of all, and make it a really like a focus on social capital. It's not going to look, even the aesthetic of leadership is not going to look the way that it has in the past. We have to be open to seeing like the soul and the heart and the spirit of a leader, a person who genuinely loves people, as opposed to the person who knows how to like be a dick. I mean, for a lack of a better phrase, like that's not cool anymore. Like the next generation wants people who care about people. They want to be loved. They want people who are going to look them in the eye and care about their real story. And they're so accustomed, like The Walking Dead, to just being invisible and to being part of like a system or an ID number, you know, from the universities to the prisons. Like we don't see each other anymore. And so I don't know. I just think it has to be, we have to get back to humanity. And I know that for some folks that sounds really woo-woo because we like methodologies and frameworks and all that. It's not working for us anymore, at least not in the way that we've been doing it. So.
Thank you, Ziddy. Over to you, Justin, maybe for a couple of thoughts here.
Yeah, I have less to say about this because I am, I've been around here a long time, and I'm really ready for young voices to take the floor, to step up and to be heard. I think, the story of Action Greensboro is exciting in a way, but it's also limiting. They had a lot of money to spend, and it was about building things. It was about things you could touch and visit and be a part of and be proud of. And it was all in one part of town, by the way. And again, the ballpark is just a couple miles from my house. That ballpark wasn't supposed to be there originally. They didn't think it would succeed in the original location. And so they moved it closer to Fisher Park. Like, those were the kinds of decisions that were being made then. I don't have any answers. I'm ready to listen. And I think we all need to be ready to listen in the majority community. And we need to be listening to voices that have something to say and that have answers that we need to get behind.
Great. Thank you, Justin. Joe, would you add anything before we kind of pivot to some small group conversations?
Sure. I think of perspective and leadership. Ziddy's mentioning, the dicks of leadership, right? There's an important distinction here. I think Michael Robinson put in here, I am we versus the great I am, right? Maybe more eloquently puts the contrast to that. This may be valid in the South, where there's churches all over the place, right? And something I gathered from the teachings of church or religions, really, around, is a lot of leadership and a lot of these figures that we look up to in a lot of the world's great religions. These leaders were about service, right? And take what you may from religion, but I think that's a really great archetype for a leader to aspire to, to think about leadership as a practice of service and listening. And it may take longer, but the results are a lot more sustainable. And if you want to go far, or if you want to go quick, you go by yourself, right? If you want to go far, you go with a group. And so we all got to be better listeners, but I think service is an important aspect in this. If we're thinking about this, and this is something I have to continue to try to remind myself, is that leadership is not about dictating things. It's about listening. It's about serving the people you lead.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. And I think the quote that you gave us, which actually comes from Africa, is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that's very much the spirit, I think, of what the data is challenging us to do. How do we come together as a community to see what's actually going on in the way that Ziddy represented and shared with us, and that the data says it's clearly there. And who's going to take ownership of that, right? It's all of us together. So I'm going to get us into small groups here in a moment. I'm just going to bring back my slide deck, because I have a set of questions here that I'd like to make the focus of our conversations. So as you look at this, and we get you into groups that will have maybe about 4 or 5 or so people, and we'd love for you to take turns and go around and say what resonated with you from what you heard, what feels true. We shared some data, you heard some perspectives. And as you think about what you heard, what's the picture that emerges for you from the poll, from the data, from the voices that were there? And then the third in this question about leadership. So what are you committed to doing? If these things are real, they belong in our community. And I think you've come to this meeting today, you've come to this gathering because you care about Greensboro, you feel deeply called to make a difference. So what are you committed to doing? It's going to take all of us, right? So I'm going to put these questions